So hello, everyone. I want to welcome you to our next author conversation. Today we have Michigan author John Smolens. And for those of you who are new to this program, the Author Conversation Program, you can always go to our website, and that website is michigan.gov/notable books to learn more about the Notable Books program, but also to see previously recorded author conversation videos. So with that, we're going to lead right into the interview. So thank you, John, for coming here today and spending some time with us.
You
So
very much.
what is the first memory you have that compelled you to write?
The very first memory. Well, when I was probably about 10 or 11, for Christmas, I think it was a Christmas present, I got this little printing press.
Oh,
And
okay.
I was a toy. Maybe I
Yeah.
was 11 or 12. But anyway, how as a kid you get deeply involved in something and then you just drop it and go on to something else. I
Yeah.
would say I don't know whether it was for a matter of a few weeks or a few months, but I tried to write a local newspaper about news in my neighborhood.
Wow. Okay.
So that was the first, yes, that's the first memory. My first memory of writing fiction,
Uh,
uh, we go back to high school.
mhm.
And there was a Christmas morning, and I grew up in New England. I grew up near
Okay.
Boston. Uh, there was a Christmas morning, and we were all sort of waiting to have, Christmas dinner and everything in
Mhm.
the early afternoon. And I was up in my room, way up on the third floor of our old house, and I don't know what prompted me, but I started writing a story in my school notebook. And it was a story about a boy who lived somewhere in the woods of New England, let's say Maine or New Hampshire. And his grandfather dies, and he's told that he has to walk into the village to get the doctor. And
Oh.
on the way into the village, he encounters a wolf. I mean,
Mhm.
this sounds like a lot of stories children heard, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Yes. Yes, it does.
Uh, and I got deeply involved in writing that story
Mhm.
for, I would say, a couple of hours.
Mhm.
And that's one of the things that I've never lost, and I think most people who write don't, is there's this sense of total immersion
Mhm.
when you're writing. You become the writing, the story, whatever it is you're writing, the words, the language, and not that everything else is obliterated, but
Mhm.
you get into a place, a mindset
Okay.
that is almost a physical transformance.
Mhm.
And that's really the first time I realized, this whole idea of writing
Mhm.
has a significance to me that I'd like to pursue. And then some years later, I actually started writing short stories when I was in college at Boston College. Yeah.
Mhm. Okay. Okay. Um, what are three words which describe you as a writer and why?
Oh boy, three words.
It's a good one. It's a good one.
That's it. That's a good one. Three words. Um, well, I use a word that someone some years ago said that you're a quote natural.
Hmm.
Okay. Now
Okay.
that might suggest that it comes easy to me, which it does not.
Oh, okay.
But what I would hope, and I think this is what this person was saying to me, was when they read something of mine, the way the story read, the language, the way the language moved,
Hmm.
the ebb and flow of the sentences and so forth, sort of came naturally.
Hmm.
It didn't seem contrived or artificial. It was just my allegiance really is to the story.
Okay.
I'm going to keep myself out of the way, if that makes
Hmm.
sense. So
Yeah.
that's one word. Um, Another word. This doesn't really describe um, how I write. Um, well, actually, it does. Let's say persistent.
Okay.
I'm persistent, and I learned that um, when I was young, when I was in college, in my teens, actually my early 20s. I was befriended by Andre Debus, who's been long since gone. He died in, I think, 1998 or 1999. A highly regarded short story writer. He lived in New England. He taught at a college where a college girlfriend of mine attended.
mm,
And I learned an awful lot from him. We actually were roommates at one point when I was a senior in college. We shared an apartment. But no matter what was going on in the rest of his life, and he had a very volatile
mm.
life
Okay.
for various reasons I won't go into,
Mm,
he was very persistent.
mm,
Uh, some might say disciplined. He would sit at his desk in the morning, and
mm,
whether he wrote a word or a page or 4 pages, he would stay at that desk for a certain period of time, and that really resonated with me. So I
mm,
hope that I have learned persistence and you know the desire to just keep going back at it. I work on certain things for years to come.
mm,
A
mm.
third word. Oh, what's a third word? Um, Boy, let's come
Yeah.
back to that one. I'll have to
Okay.
think. I'll have to think about that.
But
A word will pop into my mind. I just hope it rings true.
okay. Well, going back to that word persistence, and you said it
Yeah,
was challenging for you to write. Do you yourself have a very disciplined or schedule that you keep that you get up, I do
right.
this, right?
Um, Schedule. I won't use the word schedule,
Mm.
but and I hesitate to use the word discipline. It's different than persistent.
Okay.
Persistent means that you're willing to just keep knocking your head against that same
Mm.
brick wall.
Okay.
Whereas discipline means that you're doing something in a very orderly
Mhm.
and thoughtful manner. And I
Okay.
would not use those terms to apply to me in virtually any shape or form.
Mm.
Um, uh, try to do something at the desk every day, and I have been doing that for decades.
Mhm.
As you can see, I'm not a spring chicken. I've been at this for a while. Um, One of the side benefits of being a person who does not sleep all the way through the night,
Mhm.
which I have not done since forever, really,
Mhm.
is I learned years ago to, rather than lie in bed and sort of stare at the ceiling and, you know,
Yeah.
address all the worries in your life,
Mm.
I get up
Mm.
and I go and I sit at the desk. And much of the writing I do is done in the middle of the night. The benefit there is that uh, you know, there's no interruptions, or there's few interruptions. The
Mm.
phone doesn't ring.
Mm.
My dog, who's right here with us, usually curls up on the floor.
Yeah.
Uh, so being up in the middle of the night, actually, it's my time. It's just
Okay.
me and the words that I'm trying to issue forth, if you
Okay.
will. So, but that's not discipline. That's
Yeah.
persistence, and also the inability to sleep 7 hours of sleep a night or whatever.
But it worked. So thank you for that. But so kind of that leads me to the next question, about this particular book, A Cold Hard Prayer. What inspired you to write this?
Well, I'm very reluctant to ever use the word inspired.
Mhm.
Then people start talking about muses and so forth.
Oh, okay.
Um, some writers I think truly are inspired. I don't want to suggest that they aren't. Uh, there was no one moment. And I could say this about virtually any of the books I've written.
Okay.
With this new book, there was no one moment when I was, quote, inspired. The light bulb didn't go on suddenly.
Mhm.
It's a slow process. Maybe there's a moment where something comes into your mind, then it sort of fades away, and then it comes back. Probably because there was some kind of exterior prompt.
Okay.
Something drew me back to that.
Mhm.
Um, I've been asked this before, and it's not easy to describe. Oddly enough, I think geography was probably one of the first things that caused me to think of this story, and that's because I grew up in New England,
Mhm.
and I have lived in Michigan for the second half of my life. I moved here, like in 1985,
Yeah.
to start teaching at the universities here.
Mhm.
I have traveled back and forth between Michigan and Massachusetts for decades, and that journey between those two
Mhm.
points, in some way, caused me to think. When I first learned about these children, these orphans who were sent to the Midwest,
Mhm.
often on what was called orphan trains,
Mhm.
I said, you know, children who were sent from the Boston area, and there were many of them,
mm,
would have traveled not the exact, but a very similar route that I have been taking for years across, through Massachusetts, up over the Berkshires, across New York State. And
mm,
actually, I describe briefly at the very beginning of the book, I describe that journey
yeah,
until they arrive in the very southern portions of Michigan, right near the Ohio border.
mm,
So somehow geography
okay,
uh, was the initial impetus, or
mm,
the spark that got me going. I won't call it an inspiration though.
inspiration.
I love to look at maps.
Yes, that's fun. That's good. So for you as an author, what is the most meaningful part of this book for you?
Oh boy.
Mm.
Well, finishing it for one thing.
Well, okay. Was it,
Because for every book that I've finished, believe me, I have several that are unfinished and probably will never be finished.
okay.
And in most cases, that's probably for a good reason. Um, there's you have to, there's a pyramid element to writing fiction for me anyway. You have
Okay.
to write a certain foundation, a broad base of different kinds of stories. The best of them sort of climb on top, rise to the top of the pyramid and so forth. Um, I don't want to say that there's one particular aspect of the story that strikes me as being, let's say, the core of the
Yeah.
story. I will say that the relationship, I don't, some writers start out by plotting out the whole story in advance and then writing it. I admire that they can do that. I cannot do that. I have to start out with a blank page and kind of make my way forth in the dark
Mm,
all the way. It means I write a lot of drafts and I
yeah.
backtrack and all that. The relationship between the two orphans,
Mhm.
Mercy and the boy that was normally called Rope, um, his name actually is Lincoln Hauser. Uh, for me, as that relationship developed, that's what really was the core of the story. And then it
Mhm.
was enhanced by other relationships with Kincaid, the police chief who
Mhm.
is pursuing them and so
Yeah.
forth. But it's the relationship between those two characters
Yeah.
that I wanted to know um, how it would develop,
Mhm.
where it would take them,
Mhm.
uh, and I had to finish the book to find out.
Yeah.
Excuse me.
That's true. That's true. Excellent. So, kind of going on this on a very similar line, what do you want the reader to take away from this book?
Oh boy. Well,
That's a
I
big
was
question too.
I was keenly aware that the book is set in 1924, exactly 100 years ago.
Mhm.
And as with a number of my books, my more recent books, really, I've been writing about Michigan, situations and characters in Michigan,
Mhm.
and in most cases, they're historical. And I don't
Mhm.
like using the term historical fiction.
Mhm.
Feels like you're being pigeonholed
Okay.
in a certain way. But I was keenly aware of the fact that I was writing a story that was 1 century earlier here in Michigan.
Mhm.
Um, and for me, um, I hope that I give a real sense of what life probably was like at that point in time.
Mhm.
I, I hope I did enough reading and research
Mhm.
to understand how people lived and so forth.
Mhm.
Michigan, and I won't go too far into this because this is a whole different subject, but
Yeah.
100 years ago, Michigan was a really remarkable component, if you will, in
Mhm.
the development of 20th century America. Obviously, economically,
Mhm.
Michigan was one of the great engines of the country. The auto industry was just
Yeah.
beginning. And then there's all the business with the Ku Klux Klan. There are a lot of things that were happening then that on the surface we may say, well, they're not happening now. But many of the feelings and beliefs and emotions, both political and personal,
Yeah.
um, I think there's a correlation between what was happening back then and what much of what we're seeing here today.
Oh, interesting. What was your reaction when you learned that your book was selected as a Notable Book honoree?
I was very pleased.
You were
This is the
good.
third
Excellent.
time,
Mhm.
and every time it's been a true honor. I mean,
Yeah.
the other writers, I think the literary uh, world or society of Michigan is really quite remarkable. I like to call it when I go around to libraries
Mhm.
and schools and so forth.
Mhm.
I always feel like I already know people that I've never met before, and I like to
Mhm.
say that Michigan is the um, biggest small state in the country. Uh,
Mhm.
I could drive hundreds of miles and meet people, and I feel like
Yeah,
they've lived down the road for
very
some
true.
time. Um, I'm not sure that I'm answering your question. I think I
No,
might have gotten off,
no,
but
it is because, every author has a much different, very unique personal reaction. Um,
yeah, yeah. It's a great. All I'll say is that it's a great honor, um, uh, and to have had three of my books, my most recent three books.
mhm.
Um, it's reassuring. My
Good.
hope is that it means that I'm going down a path where there's someone out there, because you don't know who's reading your book. Someone
No,
out there thinks, what you're doing is worthwhile. You don't need awards to feel that way,
but
but when one comes your way, I feel grateful and truly honored. And again, when I go to these events in
mhm.
April at the library in
Yeah.
Michigan, and I meet the other authors, I go, I'm truly grateful to be a part of all of that.
Oh, good. Excellent. So this is kind of a several part question. So I
Oh
might need to
boy.
might
Okay.
need to read the question a couple times. So, when you learned that your book was selected, who was that first person you told, and why did you tell that person first?
Oh, that would be my wife, Ellen.
Okay.
Yeah, I would have told her first. Off the top of my head, well, I'm sure that I got an email,
Okay.
probably from Mindy. I think that's part of her
Probably.
responsibility.
Yes, that is true.
And I'm sure that Ellen was the first one that I told.
Mhm.
Um, Ellen is an art historian, retired from teaching in Massachusetts, and she reads anything that I write these days. She's the first one to read it. She is a very truthful editor,
Right?
which sometimes can make me feel like I need to crawl underneath the table, put my hands over my head,
Yeah.
but it's what she conveys about a draft is absolutely necessary. She also sees misspellings and typos and all of that, but the more important elements are that she responds to what I'm writing. So she certainly was the first one. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Wow. So could you talk a little bit more about what her reaction was to this one?
Well, Ellen's she's my since my no, I lost my mother a number of years ago. My mother was a notorious promoter of her oldest son, and Ellen has sort of taken over.
Okay.
Um, Sometimes to not great but slight embarrassment on my part. We will be somewhere in public. We'll be in a restaurant or a store or something, bookstore, and we'll be talking to someone we don't know. And the subject will be, how are the Tigers doing this year?
Yeah.
And somehow she will turn it into, well, my husband wrote another book last year. And she'll start telling him about the book and da da
Yeah.
da, and 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 I kind of want to kick her under the table and say, all right, enough, enough.
Yeah. Yeah.
But she does that, and obviously she means extremely well. Sometimes it makes me kind of feel it's not embarrassing, but I blush easily, I guess.
Yeah.
I'd
Understand.
rather talk about the Tigers
There's the-
or my Boston Red Sox.
Okay. Um, so for our last question for this author conversation
Hmm.
is what books currently are giving you joy or are making you think that you're reading right now?
Oh, I just started a novel. It's called Here in Berlin, and it's by Christina Garcia.
Okay.
Uh, Now, I've never read anything by her. I have seen that a number of her books have been very well received. And I've only read about 50 pages of this, but this is about it's fiction. It's about a fictional character who is of either Cuban or Cuban descent.
Okay.
It's an unnamed character,
Mhm.
and she travels to Berlin in modern times. And each chapter is a story about a different German, Berliner in most cases, and it all of it harkens back to World War II and
Mhm.
during Hitler's
Mhm.
reign in the Third Reich and all that.
Mhm.
It's beautifully written. The voices she
Mhm.
captures the voices of these individuals. So you read one chapter and it has a very different tone than another
Okay.
chapter. And there's a lot of things I've gotten out of these first 50 pages, but one is the power of individual voice. That's one of the beauties of fiction is
Mhm.
if an author can capture the voice not of themselves,
Yeah.
but of someone else and make it so genuine that the reader feels that person is speaking to them. And this book, Christina Garcia is her name,
Okay.
certainly does that. I'll throw out a couple of other names. I love to read any short story um, uh, by all sorts of people.
Mhm.
Um, uh, well, let me move on from that. Um,
Mhm.
what was the rest of the question? I'm sorry.
No, no, actually, no, it was, what books are currently giving you joy
Oh,
or
current books.
making you think? I mean, it could be
Okay,
either or.
right,
Um,
right, right.
um,
Let's stick with that one. I read several books at a time,
yeah,
but that one really has
it's
struck
that.
me over the last few days. Sure.
Okay, good. Um,
I go back to reading stories by people like John Cheever, Flannery O'Connor,
mhm,
Andre Dubus.
yeah, go
Um,
back. Mhm.
I love to go back. Yeah.
I understand. Well, one other last question that I'd like
Sure.
to throw in is, are you currently working on any particular
Hmm.
book right now, or could you give us a
I am. I just
little?
completed a collection of short stories.
Okay,
I don't know whether they're going to publish it yet. It's in their hands.
okay.
The collection is called Possessions,
Mhm.
and it's spelled with the last S's in parentheses because I couldn't decide whether I wanted to call the story Possession or Possessions,
Mhm.
two very different meanings.
Yes,
Ultimately, I left the parentheses there,
yes.
and that became the title story.
Okay.
Uh, then, as I said earlier, I
Mhm.
have numerous
Things floating.
unfinished novel length stories, some of which probably really never should be completed.
Mhm.
Um, but there's two, maybe three,
Mhm.
that I've been working on. I work on books for years. I mean,
Yeah.
the ones I'm thinking of, I started, I would say, anywhere from 4 to 7 years ago.
Wow.
Now,
Okay.
I don't work on them consistently. I put them aside for periods of time. I think that's
Yeah.
very good for you to sort of compost
Yeah.
a piece of writing.
Yeah.
And then when you come back to it, it seems fresh and it's new. But there are several, let's say 2 to 3.
Better.
I just want to live long enough to finish some of them.
Understand. Understand. Um, So, Mr. Smolens, I want to thank you for joining us today and being a part of our author conversation. And I want to thank all the audience who will be watching this author conversation for joining us and taking the time. And once again, for the audience, if you want to see other author conversations from previous Michigan Notable Book years, you can always go to our website, michigan.gov/notable books, and you can see the other author conversations and more information about the Michigan Notable Books program. So once again, thank you, John, for joining us today on this morning, and I hope you have a wonderful afternoon.
Thank you, Matt. Thanks very much.